Welcome, everybody, to this lecture on the philosophy of time and a little bit on space. Here we go. So, when thinking about the philosophy of time, we should sort of start, especially in metaphysics, we should kind of try to locate it in thinking a little bit about what we might think of as basic metaphysical categories. So when it comes to thinking about the kinds of things that exist and what types of things there really are in the world, we can, at the very least, sort of break things down into these very abstract kinds, right? So the very abstract kinds here, or these basic categories, are things like the categories of being an object or a particular thing, and a property. So objects are things like, things, dogs, tables, cars, money, persons, and properties, right? The properties that are had by those things, like redness or tallness or loudness or heaviness. And then, other basic metaphysical categories, right? So are actions and events. Like actions are like an action is something that an individual takes. It's not an object or a property. Right. An action is like, playing a game or doing something, driving, eating, sleeping. Whereas events are the kinds of, things that where actions occur in, or where events take place, like occurrences happen, right? So an event might be a game, like a soccer game or basketball game, or a dinner party, or just a party in general. I mean, even something simple like a shower might count as an event, right? Taking a shower. To do that is to act in a certain way, but there's the event of taking a shower that you participate in. But then finally, like, so these things, actions and events, they're not objects or properties. They're kinds of different kinds of metaphysical categories. So now we've got the world divvied up into objects, properties, actions, and events. But there seems to be some more stuff out there, at least fundamentally, when it comes to thinking about the kinds of things that there are. And two of the categories that are very much of interest are of space and time. Particularly here, thinking about time. But so like, what is space and what is time? Space isn't necessarily like an object, right? It's kind of the absence of an object, and it's also not necessarily a property. It fits. It seems to fit a property, right? It tells you where something is if you're worried about its spatial proper an object's spatial properties. But space itself isn't a property, right? I mean, it's like it's the bucket into which things go, right? It's not a feature of the things themselves. Similarly with time, right? So what is time? It seems not to be the right kind of thing to think of time as a uh, a feature like redness of a ball or something like that, right? No, time seems to be this feature of events. It seems to be the kind of thing that, when something happens, or, whether or not something is happened in the past long ago, or whether or not something is upcoming and to happen in the future. So this is, just to spread these things out. We've now got some basic metaphysical categories, and in doing metaphysics, of course, we talk and think about each of these things. And so let's just pick on time. So there seems to be some basic properties that time has. One of them, obviously, in the ways that we talk, it becomes clear that we talk like this, that we say that time passes. So we say that time has like some kind of direction. It goes from one place to another, right? There's this thing called the past, and there's this thing called the future, and there's this thing called the present. And the present is not in the past or in the future. However, all past events were at one time present events, and all future events at one point will be present events, right? Um, but that doesn't tell us what time is. That just tells us, that there is this sort of sequence: the past, the present, and the future. And it seems that time kind of moves through this sequence in some sense, right? From events that are now past, to events that are now present, to events that are eventual, that are now at least in the future. So, but then there's there's a kind of question that philosophers will want to ask. Well, okay, if time passes, what in the world, like how in the world does it pass? What is time really, right? If we've got these describing features that time involves past, present, and future, but what is time? Um, and in asking what is time and knowing that we've got these things like the present and the past, the present, and the future, we need to take seriously and be able to explain in a theory of time what these things are, what it is for something to be past, what it is for something to be future, what pastness is, what futurity is, and then also what it is that differentiates the past from the present and the present from the future, right? So we get to these kinds of questions in metaphysics about existence, about what kinds of things exist. And so we can ask, well, does the past exist or does the future exist? And then sort of what is the present, right? So clearly you're existing in a present time. You're listening to this recording right now, right? Whatever present time it is for you. The recording clearly happened in the past, right? From whatever time you're at. Because for me right now, I know that I have to record this and then I have to post it and then it will eventually be replayed. But that time at which it's replayed is in the future. So it's an interesting question, though, like whether or not the past that you are thinking about right now when I recorded this lecture, when I'm now recording this lecture, whether or not that time exists in some sense, right? I mean, so clearly it's past, right? Right? It came to be and then it went away in a sense. So does the past exist? What about the future, right? Like tomorrow, you can think about tomorrow. You know what? You might know what you're going to do tomorrow, but does tomorrow exist sort of now already? Like it seems weird to think about there being these like future entities that are just kind of waiting around to become present. But some people, might think that they do. Or is it really that, time as its own thing can be in some sense reduced away? Like there isn't really time. What there is just three-dimensional objects that are moving in a four-dimensional space. And, so because of that fourth dimension, they are allowed, to exist over time in a sense. Or is time just the fourth dimension, really, that we should be thinking about? Maybe that's what it is. All right, so let's start to be a little bit more careful. Clearly, there are events that occur, right? I mean, nobody denies, I think, the existence of events, right? So right now, there's this event, this lecture, right? It's the whole thing, had a beginning, has a middle, has an end. The beginning is before the middle is before the end. The middle, we're getting close to the middle probably now. The present moment is maybe near the middle of this event, so on and so forth, right? And events have temporal properties, right? Events are either past, present, or future. There are events that are going on now. There are events that have completed, right? They're no longer going on, like, I don't know, the last Olympics or the presidential race or something like that. And there are events that are going to go on in the future, right? The next Olympics or the next Laker basketball game, who knows? The next semester. Those are all events that have temporal properties of, pastness, presentness, or futurity. So it seems to make sense to think of events as having properties or features that relate them to time, that they occur in time, right? That these events have some kind of being in time. And that makes sense, right? Because something happened yesterday, an event. Something will happen tomorrow, an event. That's past and the future. Those are events in the past and the future, and so those events have properties of being in the past and being in the future. Now that brings us then to a couple of different views in general of time. And one of these is sort of a reductionist theory, and one of these is a theory that says time is its own thing. So here's kind of two basic ideas of what you might think about time when in terms of talking about events, right? So the first is the reductionist view of time. The reductionist view of time says time just is all of the events that ever happen, right? So the idea is like, think about supposing that time has a beginning. We'll just like maybe for fun, assume time began at the Big Bang. That always begs the question, well, what happened before the Big Bang? But we're just assuming for our sakes currently. Imagine time begins at the Big Bang. Well, then what time is on this theory is that all events that have happened between the Big Bang and now, you can sort of add them all up. Suppose time is going to end at the big smush, which like is the opposite of the Big Bang. Everything kind of smushes back together, something like that. And all the things that happen in between, all the events that occur, well, that's what time just is. You just sort of take all of those events, you add them up, and then you've got time. And so what it is here, the idea is that really there are just events that exist, right? And time is just ought to be thought of as the conglomeration, the sum of all events. And so the idea here is basically like, each event, each instant of time, each second or parasecond or whatever quanta of time that there is, you take each one and you string it together, and then that's what time is. That's each event plus each other event, and you get through this entire line of events, this whole sequence of events, and that's time. And so time is this thing that is, doesn't exist in and of itself, but it exists as a lot of different events. And so you think of events as related to one another, and then you get this kind of theory of, okay, so this event happened and then this event happened, and that's why one event happened in the past and another event happened in the future, or really one event happened before another one, right? And that helps us make sense of how one event could be after another, and so one event was in the future from the sake of the event that happened before it. So that's one view of time. The other view of time that people sometimes take is to deny that events are all that it is that make time up, and accept instead that time is its own thing, right? Time is like this separate entity that exists in and of itself and just kind of ticks on for forever. I mean, maybe it started at some point and ends at some point, but it's its own thing. It's kind of the substrata in which events occur, right? So the idea here would be something like, there is this arena of time, and events take place within that arena, right? So you've got this big kind of you'll see in a second, this big kind of bucket of time, and each little droplet of water is an event within that bucket, and that event is its own separate thing, but it's separate from time. Time is its own real entity in some sense. I mean, it's not an object, it's just a thing that exists, whatever that means. And events are things that take place in time. Now, this view, it takes time to be its own thing, and so it's separated from the other view, because the other view says that time is reduced to events. In this view, no, time is a separate thing, and events are especially related to what time is. Now, these two views kind of match with two prominent views of what space is, and that's why space and time are so closely related. And these two views, basically, so first let's take the original, the second view here, that says time is a real thing that exists on its own. Well, there's a view of space that says that space exists in and of itself. It's just this kind of big empty bucket, right? Maybe it's an infinite bucket that goes on for forever, right? But it's this big empty place, and things, objects like physical stuff, happens in space, right? It's located in a place. So sometimes thinking about like time and space in the same way, because it can sometimes help, right? So imagine there's this infinite vast nothingness, blank, empty space, and things, pop into existence in it, right? So there's a planet over here, and a universe over here, and a person over there. Those things are in space. And so space is just its own separate thing. It's the empty void, and then objects occur in it. That's one theory of space. A different theory of space is that there really isn't any sort of empty void. What space is, and the only way we can really understand space, is by reducing space to the relationships that things stand in, the distance relationships that things stand in. So really there isn't this empty void. All there is just the objects. There's, a planet over here, a universe over here, a person over here, and then there's a space, right? There's a distance between this planet and this other star, right? So you take this one star and this one planet, and you measure the distance between them, and that is the space between them, right? And really what space is just, you just reduce all of these sort of distance relationships between objects, or that's what space is. Space is basically just made up of all the distance relationships between objects. And so that, I think it's actually a little bit funny. This is the reverse. On this view, it's easier to think of how time is just made up of the events that are constantly going on, whereas space, it's a little bit harder to think of it along these lines. But it kind of starts to make sense when you think like really there isn't space in some sort of abstract, or like space isn't like a thing in and of itself. It's a void, right? And what there is there's just emptiness. And then when we talk about space, we're actually talking about the relationships of distance between things, right? All right, so that gets us at kind of two very general views of time and space. And it's helpful to kind of have this as we start thinking about what time really is. Here's, a good joke meme, what people thought about time, right? So Aristotle thinking that time is real, Kant thinking that time is an illusion, but Marx pretty much, nailed it, thinking that time is really just an invention of clock companies to sell more clocks, kind of like Valentine's Day is an invention of card companies to sell more greeting cards or love cards. All right, so going beyond these sort of bare abstract theories of time and whether or not time in and of itself is something, we get these different kind of more specific theories of time, and about like that take into account what kinds of things about time exist, like how the future, past, and present are related to one another. And so there are kind of two major theories. One's called Presentism and one's called Eternalism. And then there's like variants of the two major theories. And so let me explain some of them, and then we'll talk about some problems for them. So Presentism is the view that really all that exists is the present moment. And so the idea here is something like this, right? When we're talking about what exists in the sort of real and normal way, we don't want to say that the past exists or that the future exists, right? We want to say that, the past there was something that was past, but it no longer exists. Like maybe you have a grandma, or certainly like a great grandparent that has passed away. They no longer exist, right? It's not as if somehow in the past they still exist, right? That would be a strange thing to think. That's kind of the idea that Presentism has. It's that no, there isn't really a past. Like there is there is a past. Like it makes sense to talk about the past, but the past no longer exists. All that exists really is the present moment. And when we talk about the future, similarly, we don't want to say that the future does exist. We're just saying that, there are these moments that will come to be present. And so when we're thinking about them, we're not talking about them as sort of already existing. We're just, projecting in a sense into the future and discussing how the present moment kind of changes. Things change, and from time to time, the present shifts towards the future, and so events that are in the future will eventually take place. And so, the future doesn't sort of exist on its own, somehow apart from the present. All that really exists is the present, but we have ways of talking about things that happened in the past, things that were present, and ways of talking about things that will happen in the future, things that will come to be. In a sense, that's like the way that tense works too, right? So that's the idea here, is that when we talk using tensed language, like, you put ed at the end of a word, of an action verb, right? Things that happened in the past, and then you use the word will to discuss things that will happen in the future, things that are coming to be. Now, presentism is a really interesting theory, and it sort of, reduces time to just the present moment, and then reduces time, in a sense, to the present moment and all of the events kind of taking place in the present moment and how things shift, right? You've just got like this three-dimensional world, but things are kind of in motion, right? Things are in motion, and really at any given time, there's just like one snapshot of the universe of things that are in motion, and that's the present moment. And the previous snapshots of the universe are how things were in the past, and the future, the snapshots that you can project, you will be able to take, is just how the future is going to be. But some people dislike this idea, in a sense, because they think like, look, like I understand why the future doesn't exist yet, but I really do feel like, the past is there, right? Like the past is there. If the past wasn't there, how could the present really be? How could things be the way that they are now if it didn't make sense to talk about the past as existing? So some people, they accept a form of presentism where it's like, yeah, the present moment clearly exists, but they also want to accept that something else exists, like the past, right? And so generally there are theories that are, what are often called the growing or shrinking block theories. And the growing block theory is the idea that time may have started at some point, but then time has just kind of grown as time has gone on, right? As the present moment has shifted from one moment to the next, we've got this growing block of time. And, at the edge of the growing block is the present, but the rest of the block is all of the things that have happened in the past, right? So the past, on this view, does exist, and it's all of the stuff that's gone on before us, but it doesn't, like, but the things that are in it, they're in the past, right? The present is this sort of special thing at the front of the growing block, and all the other stuff happened in the past. A more odd view, but a view that some people might be interested in, is like they reject the idea that the past is in any way special, but they think that like the future is somehow special. They think like, look, no, maybe you accept like God laid out the future for us, and so we're just going across, like we're following a particular timeline, and that's just how it is. And so this view, while odd, is also often called the shrinking timeline, where the idea is like there's this block that's laid out before us, all these paths that we have to already take, predestined for us, and as the present comes, we know the block kind of shrinks 1 second at a time, and but it's all laid out before us, and so we have these predestined paths, and so the future is real in the sense it exists. The present is real, it exists in a sense, but the past, things in the past, they're past, right? They no longer exist. All right. So that's one view, presentism, and some variants of it, the growing and shrinking timeline. Eternalism is the other view, and often eternalism is thought of basically as a view where past, present, and future exist as just sort of this entire temporal block. Like the block is a metaphor, but it's the easiest way to think about it. Like just think in terms of like a four-dimensional block that's like really long, right? And at one, there's time t1 at point 1, and time t2 at in the middle, and time t3, and all of these events just kind of are related to one another. And we can, supposing time isn't infinite, there's a beginning and an end. We've got this sort of encased block where all of time exists and all of the physical stuff that happens is within that block. This is supposed to be, like all of time. That's the eternalist view. Each moment in time is related to all of the other moments in time, right? So if you take a block, you go and like find a particular slice of the block. Well, that slice, anything to one side of it is going to be past, and anything to the other side of it is going to be future. And anything else, anything that's happening like in that slice is, happening at the same time or something like that, right? So, and then the idea is supposed to be something like, well, wherever the present is, things that happened before that slice are the things that are in the past, and the things that are happening in front of that slice are the things that will happen in the future. All of these things all already in some sense exist. It's not like a time thing, right? It's not like they exist now because that matters. All that now is referring to is the particular time at which, things are currently, and time is going to continue to go forward. And so, that's how that makes sense in a sense. So here we've got these three kind of models, right? We've got presentism, which just takes the, now time slice as the things that exist. And, the future is just how things are going to continue to be. And the past is how things were. The pastist view of presentism is this sort of, we've got now, and this sort of cone going down is all of the things that happened in space in the past. Or you can sort of imagine like flipping this on its head and getting a futurist view, where really there's all of these things that are going to happen in the future, and really all that exists, like now exists, but then things are moving, things are sort of shrinking into the future. And then we've got the eternalist view. The eternalist view being kind of this cone shaped thing where there's a past on one side and a future on the other side. And but really it's just this kind of big blocky kind of thing that exists with all events and all time within it. All right, so now let's move on to some basic problems that you might run into for each of these views and how you might solve them, right? So, well, not really necessarily how you might solve them, but just some things worth thinking about. So one problem for presentism is the problem of how long the present is, right? Like, what is a moment in time? Is it really just like an instant? Is it longer than an instant? I mean, it seems like, so like, think about space. Think about what it is for something to be located in space. It seems that for something to be located in space, it has to have what we might think of as extension. It has to be three-dimensional in some weird way. I mean, maybe just two-dimensional, but even like a two-dimensional drawing has like little bit of three dimension. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see it. So it seems like for something to take place in time, it has to endure for a minimal amount of time, right? There has to be some duration from the beginning to the end of the moment, right? Of the present time. So there's this interesting question. Well, what is the present? How long does the present last? I mean, is it right now, this minute? Is it today? Is it this week? Is it just this hour? Like, what counts as now? It's an interesting thing to think about, that like the English word now, as we use it, is really flexible. We are able to use the English word now to talk about all sorts of things, right? We talk about now meaning this year or this current era, right? Like if you're talking about the dinosaurs and then you're talking about like the difference between the dinosaur time and now, you don't mean this instant. You mean like the last 100 years, the last epoch. But when you're talking about like now in the context of this class, maybe you're talking about today, right? Last week we didn't have class. Now we do have class, right? Because of what, there was like a holiday or something. So there's sort of this problem for presentism, which is just without a kind of theory of what a moment in time is, we don't really know what the present is to begin with. And if we don't know what the present is to begin with, or how long the present takes, or when the present is, if we don't know what the present is, like, why should we accept presentism? We need more explanation. We need more theory. We need some more data points in order to think of this view as any good. This brings us also to a more serious problem, at least theoretically, insofar as it seems like if we're thinking about the present moment, that if that present moment is all that exists, then it seems like whatever is happening at the present moment in the world is all happening at exactly the same time, right? It's all got to be happening absolutely simultaneously. And then that's it, right? Like, it happens all right now, and then it's, and then that moment passes and it's in the past, and the future moment comes into being. However, if presentism is true, that means that there should be one single present now. And at that time, something that's part of the universe should be happening over here and happening over there, and et cetera, et cetera. But according to modern physics, that is like relativity theory, thanks Einstein, there isn't such a thing as absolute simultaneity. Things, according to Einstein, because this has to do with a complicated theory of space-time as one entity, where space and time aren't actually separated. But according to this thing, events happen in time relative to frames of reference. So depending on sort of where you are and how fast you're moving. So something might happen before or after something else happens, depending on where you are and how fast you're moving. And if there is no now at which things can happen at the same time, then it seems like there can't really be any present, right? Like, at least in the presentist sense. And that seems a little problematic. I mean, it definitely seems problematic for presentism. It seems a little bit crazy when you think about it, the idea that there couldn't be any present. Maybe present, when we're talking about the present, is only relative to our frame of reference, because we're all pretty much moving at the same speed with our planet, moving as it is in our universe, like in our solar system and galaxy moving as fast as they are. So I don't know. It's hard to think about these things in any serious sense without doing a bunch of math problems. And it's really hard to sort of visualize what it would mean to think about these things. But, we're trying to do philosophy. Philosophy's hard. So it's worth kind of trying to expand your mind a little bit to think about these things. So the thought here, problem for presentism: if there really isn't any absolute simultaneity, then what sense can be made about what the present is, right? It just seems like the present has to be the absolutely simultaneous moment in time in which things occur across the universe. And if there isn't one of those, then, well, it seems like presentism is stuck. All right, so moving from presentism, we get problems for eternalism. And eternalism basically has one major problem. It can't explain the present. And then there's an attempted fix for it. And then, yeah, that should be it for today. So if time is everything, eternalism is sort of everything that happens in this four-dimensionalist block, right? We've got the past and the future. We've just got this block, and all time is in this block. And what time is kind of just this sequence of events, right? We've got, the things that happened at the beginning of time, the things that happened that are going to happen at the end of time. And then there's just, the relationship between them, right? One comes to one side of the other, and so the ones on the earlier side are in the past, and the ones on the later side are in the future, and that's how you understand how they were related to one another. Well, if you're thinking about that sequence of events in the block, like, I don't know, imagine you're like, take God's eye point of view, and you're looking at the block, and you're like, okay, this part on the left here is in the past, this part on the right here is in the future. But then you're like looking for the present. Well, what sets the present apart from the past and the future? Like, what is it about that present moment that makes it the present moment? I mean, it's just one among the sequence of all of the events that are happening in this block, right? This block of time. What makes the present special in any way? If all of time sort of already exists, that is the past and the future, what could possibly make the present special? So for the eternalist, it seems like, the moment of the present is just another moment among all the other moments in the sequence, all the other events in the sequence. So in what sense, I mean, so like it makes sense when you're talking about a sequence to talk about how some members of the sequence come before other members. So we can understand how, like, relative to a particular member of the sequence, there are events that come before it and so are past to it, and other members that come after it, which are future to it. But what about, like, why would we pick that one? Like, what is it that makes that one special? What is it that makes any particular of those members in the sequence now, right? What makes it, if those members of the sequence are all events, what makes now, right? If all of time already exists, like, not already, but just exists in some sense, what makes the present special? Like, obviously the present is special in some way, right? And it seems like the eternalist doesn't really have an answer. So what the eternalist has to do here is they have to postulate a special kind of direction and present moment. They have to assume that there's, and this is often called the spotlight view or the flashlight view. And the idea is something like, look, we've got this timeline of, all of time. We've got the past, the present, and the future, but like all of this time sort of exists. And then really there is one particular moment in time that is currently special. That's the moment that, we're highlighting. Supposedly, I mean, so to take the metaphor further, imagine you're God, you're looking at this big blocky, time space universe thing, and you've got your finger somewhere in the middle, right? And you're highlighting one time slice, and that time happens to be the present time, and you're slowly kind of moving your finger on and that's how the time moves from the past to the future. So that's, the eternalist picture here. Here we get the sort of extra model of time, right? Eternalism is this view that all of time exists, but then there's also this thing, this special present, and the special present is somehow, the like it adds another layer to time, because we need to be able to explain the present, right? And why it is that time seems like it passes, right? Why it seems like it goes from the past to the future. Whereas like the eternalist view just doesn't seem like it can do anything, like the plain eternalist view, right? Doesn't seem like it can do anything to explain how time passes, because it just, assumes that all of time exists, and then it explains how things can be in the past and things can be in the future relative to the order of the events, but it doesn't tell you anything about how that order gets, right now, like what that order has to do with the current moment. So there's the problem, though, for eternalism plus the special present, and that problem is that the theory seems ad hoc. Well, what is it for something to be ad hoc? Well, when a theory is ad hoc, it's that, it's basically just adding stuff, adding more theory, but adding the more theory doesn't seem to be motivated by the original theory. And the stuff that you add in order to fix the theory, it doesn't really explain what it's trying to explain, right? So here's the thought here. Adding in the idea that there's got to be a special present moment, or a special moment being picked out by, God, or a flashlight in some way, that doesn't really explain anything about the present. That just adds more theory, right? That just adds extra baggage to be explained to the eternalist theory. Now we need to know, about the past, present, and the future, and how they all exist, as well as know what it is about the present that makes it special. And the eternalist doesn't give anything at all here. Um, let's explain why. Let me explain why that's bad. So ad hoc theories are all over the place, and you probably run into them, especially in this modern day and age where there's all kinds of conspiracy theories. So, but here's like a simple one that everybody's probably at least somewhat familiar with: the theory of astrology. Astrology, if people ask you what's your sign, are you Aries, Taurus, Sagittarius? And the basic idea is supposed to be that depending on when you were born, the stars and the planets were aligned in a specific way, and how they were aligned is supposed to have some kind of effect on your life. However, if you press a person that believes in astrology, the effect that these stars and planets have on your life, they can't have any kind of physical effect, right? Because if they had a physical effect, I mean, they do, the stars and planets do have some minimal physical effect on you, right? That's because they are subject to the laws of physics, and so like they have minimal gravitational effects on you and stuff like that. But the gravitational effects that they have on you don't influence your basic personality traits. Right? They just influence how, like, where you are, right? Like how the planet is spinning and stuff like that. So the astrologists have to postulate some kind of mystical force or mystical power that the mere location of these planets and stars have on your basic personality and life. And that like they give you the horoscopes, and horoscopes are supposed to tell you what's gonna happen to you. But there's no explanation of what the mystical force or mystical power is that somehow has something to do with these stars and planets and how it gets to you or affects you. Now, that's an ad hoc theory, right? What they're doing is they're postulating the existence of a mystical force that we don't know about in order to explain away a problem for their theory, right? The problem for their theory is that they haven't offered an explanation of how the stars and planets can have an effect on your life. And then when you ask them, they'll say, "Oh, well, there's this mystical force." And then you ask them, "Well, what's the mystical force? Like, explain the mystical force to me." And they'll say, "Oh, we don't know. I mean, there's nothing to be said there." Well, the same sort of thing seems to go for eternalism with the special present, right? You give the eternalist this problem. Well, hey, how do you explain what the present is? And they say, "Oh, well, there's just this special present." And then you say, "Well, what's that? Like, can you explain that to me? How does that work?" And it doesn't seem like they can go any deeper. So, problem for eternalism plus the special present is just that the theory seems rather ad hoc. It kind of adds more stuff to it to explain that doesn't, necessarily seem to be part of the original theory that says that, all of time exists, past, present, and future. So finally, this, brings us to the end. What is time really, right? Like what really what is time? I mean, what's going on here? So it seems like we have some good theories about what time could be, right? But each theory has problems, and we don't have great answers for these problems, right? But whatever time really is, it seems like we get along fine talking the way that we do. And even if there really isn't a sort of absolute simultaneity, as physics seems to tell us, it sure does seem like things happen at the same time from our own point of view. So, what's left then is kind of this interesting question about whether the past and the future exist in the same way that the present does, or whether or not the present is somehow special, right? And so, really, you end up with, I think, this way of thinking about whether or not time is just a reduction to all of the events that occur, and whether or not the events that exist are kind of just this one big event that is the present event. And that event kind of, goes on and on and on and changes, or whether there's this big collection of events from the past to the future, and they're all strung together, and somehow the middle one, whatever that middle special present one is special for some reason. And that's where we're kind of, I think, stuck here in thinking about the metaphysics and in offering interesting theories about what's going on. Next time, or sort of the next lecture in this week, we're going to discuss the persistence through time, in particular, thinking about the worm theory. So the worm theory has to do with thinking about the universe as this kind of box, this temporal box where all of the events happen. And then when you're thinking about like what a particular thing is in this space-time continuum, what a thing is basically a space-time worm that happens, that goes through time from one place to another, sort of is spread out in time in the same way that we are spread out in space. And that will help lead us eventually into our discussion of personal identity in thinking about what it is that a person actually is. All right, have a good week. Thank you for listening.